We won't take our clothes off. What American soldiers did next left German women POWs in tears. The war was over, but for the prisoners behind barbed wire, the battle to reclaim their humanity had just begun. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces swept across a fractured Germany, they encountered something unexpected among the ruins and the refugees. Not just soldiers laying down arms, but entire communities caught in the machinery of total war. Women who had served in auxiliary roles, in factories and field hospitals, now found themselves on the other side of liberation. They waited in makeshift camps, uncertain whether mercy or vengeance would greet them. The fence that separated them from their captors was thin, but the divide between enemy and human beings seemed infinite. What happened next would challenge everything both sides believed about war, about dignity, and about what it means to show grace when you have every reason not to. Before we go further, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're new here, hit subscribe so you never miss our next story. The scene unfolded in a rural stretch of Bavaria, near the town of Freising, 20 miles north of Munich. April had turned to May, and the Third Reich had collapsed in upon itself like a dying star. Hitler was dead in his bunker. Berlin had fallen. The German military was surrendering in fragments across Europe. In this particular corner of southern Germany, the American 7th Army had established temporary detention facilities for prisoners of war. Unlike the massive camps that would later hold hundreds of thousands, these were hastily erected holding areas, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by infantrymen who had been fighting their way through France and into Germany for nearly a year. They were tired. They had seen friends die. They had liberated concentration camps and witnessed horrors that would haunt them forever. Their view of Germany and its people had been shaped by months of brutal combat and the evidence of unspeakable crimes. Among the prisoners were approximately 300 women, ranging in age from 17 to 45. They had worked as radio operators, clerks, nurses, and factory workers. Some had been members of the League of German Girls, the female branch of the Hitler Youth. Others had simply been conscripted into war work as the Reich grew desperate for labor. They wore a mixture of uniforms and civilian clothes, most of it torn or filthy from weeks on the road. Germany's infrastructure had disintegrated. Transportation networks had been bombed into uselessness. Many of these women had walked for days, fleeing the advancing Soviet forces from the east, only to stumble into American lines in the west. They were exhausted, hungry, and terrified. Rumors had spread among them about what happened to women taken prisoner, stories of brutality and revenge that echoed the very propaganda they had been fed for years. The camp itself was nothing more than an open field surrounded by wire, with a few canvas tents and wooden latrines hastily constructed at one end. There were no barracks, no beds, barely any shelter from the rain that fell in cold sheets during those early May nights. The women huddled together for warmth, sharing what little food they had managed to carry with them. American guards patrolled the perimeter, rifles slung over their shoulders, faces blank with exhaustion, and something harder to name. They had orders to maintain order and prevent escapes, but beyond that, the rules were unclear. This was not a permanent installation. It was a holding pen, a way station while higher command decided what to do with the tens of thousands of German civilians and auxiliary personnel flooding into Allied custody. The women watched the guards, and the guards watched them, each side trying to read the intentions of the other across a distance measured not just in yards but in years of enmity and war. On the third day of their captivity, something shifted. The camp commandant, a captain from Ohio named Robert Callahan, received orders from divisional headquarters. The prisoners were to be processed and transferred to a larger facility within the week. But before that could happen, they needed to be deloused and medically examined. Typhus and other diseases had swept through the refugee columns. The Americans could not risk an outbreak. The order was clear and came with standard military procedure. The women were to remove their clothing, be examined by medical personnel, and receive clean garments if available. The process was meant to be efficient, impersonal, and sanitary, but no one had considered how it would be received by women who had already lost everything, who saw themselves as completely vulnerable, and who feared the worst from their captors. What should have been a routine health measure became something far more complex. When the announcement was made, It spread through the camp like a shockwave. A German-speaking American sergeant, a second-generation immigrant from Pennsylvania, delivered the instructions through the fence. The women were to assemble in groups of 20. They would be escorted to a tent where they would undress, be examined, and receive clean clothing. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Some women began to cry. Others shouted in protest. A few simply sat down in the mud and refused to move. They had heard stories, whispered accounts of what soldiers did to women in war. The propaganda they had grown up with had painted the Allies, particularly the Soviets, but also the Americans, as barbaric and cruel. Now, being ordered to strip in front of their captors seemed to confirm their worst fears. The sergeant tried to explain that female nurses would conduct the examinations, that this was about health and safety, but his words were drowned out by the rising tide of panic and defiance. The women refused. It was not an organized rebellion, not a coordinated act of resistance. It was something more fundamental, a collective assertion of dignity in the face of what they perceived as dehumanization. They would not remove their clothes. They would not submit to what they believed was coming. Some of the younger women clung to the older ones, seeking protection or reassurance. Others stood with their arms crossed, faces set in expressions of grim determination. The German they spoke among themselves was rapid and urgent, a mixture of fear and resolve. The guards watched this unfold with confusion. They had expected compliance, perhaps some grumbling, but not outright refusal. Captain Callahan was summoned. He stood outside the wire, hands on his hips, trying to understand what was happening. His interpreter explained the situation. The women thought they were going to be assaulted. They believed this was a pretext for something terrible. Callahan was a schoolteacher before the war, a man who had spent his adult life shaping young minds in a small town outside Cleveland. He had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, trained as an officer, and led men through some of the hardest fighting in the European theater. He had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. He had also seen the camps, the piles of bodies, the walking skeletons who had somehow survived the Nazi death machinery. His feelings toward Germany were complicated and raw. But standing there, looking at these frightened women, he felt something shift inside him. They were not the architects of genocide. They were not the SS guards who had run the camps. They were people caught in the collapse of a nation, terrified and vulnerable. He made a decision that was not in his orders, that came from some other place entirely. He told his men to stand down. He would find another way. What happened next would stay with everyone present for the rest of their lives. Callahan ordered the medical examination postponed. Instead, he arranged for food to be brought in, real food from the American field kitchens. Hot soup, bread, and coffee. The women had been surviving on scraps for days. When the guards began distributing the meal, suspicion mixed with hunger. Some refused at first, convinced it was a trick or that the food was poison. But hunger is a powerful force, and eventually they ate. The warmth of the soup, the taste of something other than stale bread or nothing at all, began to thaw the frozen terror just slightly. Callahan did not address them directly that day. He simply ensured they were fed, that they had access to clean water, and that the guards maintained a respectful distance. He was buying time, trying to figure out how to proceed without force, without confirming their fears. Over the next 2 days, a strange transformation occurred. Callahan brought in female personnel from nearby medical units, nurses and support staff, and had them interact with the prisoners. He arranged for the women to receive blankets and whatever spare clothing could be found. He made sure the latrines were improved and that a degree of privacy was established. These were small gestures, practical measures, but they communicated something larger. The prisoners began to understand that they were not going to be harmed, that the Americans were not the monsters they had been told to fear. Slowly, tentatively, some of the younger women began to cooperate. They agreed to medical screenings conducted by the female nurses, in private, with dignity. Others watched and saw that nothing terrible happened. Trust, fragile and conditional, began to form. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. It was simply the recognition that these particular captors were choosing to behave differently than expected. The turning point came on the 6th day. An older woman, perhaps 50, who had been among the most vocal in her refusal, approached the fence and asked to speak with the commandant. Her name was Margaret, and she had worked as a nurse in a military hospital near Frankfurt before fleeing west. She spoke some English, learned before the war when she had briefly studied in London. She told Callahan that the women would cooperate with the medical examinations under certain conditions. They wanted privacy, female examiners only, and a guarantee that they would not be separated from one another or transported without notice. Callahan agreed to everything. He had already planned to do most of it anyway, but hearing the request, seeing this woman summon the courage to advocate for her companions, moved him. He shook her hand through the wire, a gesture that shocked both of them. She was the enemy. He was the conqueror. And yet, in that moment, they were simply two people trying to navigate an impossible situation with whatever humanity they could muster. The examinations proceeded over the next 3 days without incident. The women were treated with respect and care. Those who were ill received medical attention. Clean clothing, mostly surplus military garments, was distributed. The camp remained a grim place, but it was no longer ruled entirely by fear. The American soldiers, many of whom had entered Germany with nothing but rage and grief, found themselves reassessing their assumptions. These were not the fanatical enemies they had been fighting. These were people scared and defeated, trying to survive the consequences of a war they had not started, but had been swept up in nonetheless. Some of the guards began small acts of kindness, sharing cigarettes, bringing extra rations, speaking a few words of broken German. It was not camaraderie, but it was something more than hostility. The lines between victor and vanquished, between enemy and human being, began to blur in small but significant ways. But the story does not end there, because history is never so simple or so clean. Elsewhere in Germany, the treatment of prisoners was far harsher. Thousands died from disease and starvation in overcrowded camps. Brutality and revenge were common. The women in this particular camp were fortunate, though they might not have felt it at the time. They were experiencing an anomaly, a moment where individual choices created a pocket of decency in the midst of chaos. Captain Callahan would later be reprimanded by a superior officer for exceeding his authority and delaying the processing schedule. The reprimand was mild and ultimately without consequence, but it reminded him that compassion in war is often seen as weakness or inefficiency. He did not regret his decision. Years later, in letters and interviews, he would describe those days in Bavaria as among the most important of his life, the moment when he chose to see people rather than enemies. For the women, the experience was equally transformative, but in different ways. Liberation was not what they had imagined. They had expected either death or some form of salvation, but this was neither. It was strange and uncomfortable and tinged with shame. They had been on the wrong side of history, even if their individual roles were small. The kindness they received from their captors did not erase that, but it complicated the narrative they had been given about the Allies, about the Americans, about the nature of the enemy. Some of them would spend the rest of their lives grappling with what it meant that they had been treated with humanity by people they had been taught to hate. Margaret, the woman who had negotiated the terms of their cooperation, would later write in her diary that the hardest part was not the captivity itself, but the realization that everything she had believed about the war had been built on lies. The Americans were supposed to be cruel. They were supposed to confirm the propaganda. Instead, they had shown her something she was not prepared for, and it shattered her understanding of the world. The camp was dismantled within 2 weeks. The women were transferred to a larger facility near Augsburg, where they were eventually screened and released over the following months. Some returned to homes that no longer existed. Others found their families scattered or dead. Germany in the summer of 1945 was a landscape of ruin, both physical and moral. The women carried with them the memory of those strange days in the camp near Freising, the days when they had refused to undress and the Americans had chosen not to force them. For some, it was a source of relief and even gratitude. For others, it was a source of confusion and guilt. How do you reconcile kindness from an enemy with the knowledge of what your nation had done? How do you accept grace when you are not sure you deserve it? These questions had no easy answers, and they would haunt many of these women for the rest of their lives. The soldiers, too, were changed by the experience. They had been trained to see the Germans as the enemy, as the perpetrators of great evil, and that training was not wrong. Germany had unleashed a catastrophic war and committed genocide on an industrial scale. But these women in the camp were not Hitler. They were not Himmler or Goebbels. They were individuals who had made choices, some coerced, some willing, but who were now facing the consequences in a very personal way. The Americans who guarded them learned that even in war, even after witnessing the worst of humanity, it was still possible to choose decency. It was still possible to see a person, not just as a symbol or a category. Some of the soldiers would later say that this was the moment they understood what they had been fighting for, not just to defeat an enemy, but to uphold a different vision of what human beings could be to one another. There were no cameras to record what happened in that camp. No journalists wrote about it at the time. It was a small event in the vast sweep of the war's end, easily overlooked in the chaos of Germany's collapse in the beginning of the occupation. But the people who were there remembered. They told their children and grandchildren. They wrote letters and kept diaries. And in those private records, a different story of the war's end emerged, one that did not fit neatly into narratives of triumph or tragedy. It was a story about fear and trust, about the fragility of human dignity and the power of small acts of decency. It was a story that asked difficult questions about how we treat those who have been our enemies and what it means to be merciful when we have every reason not to be. In the decades that followed, historians would piece together the broader picture of the war's end in Europe. They would document the massive displacement of populations, the trials at Nuremberg, the division of Germany, and the beginning of the Cold War. The story of the camp near Freising would remain a footnote, if that, in the larger historical record. But for those who were there, it was everything. It was the moment when they confronted the limits of propaganda and ideology, when they discovered that the enemy was not monolithic, and that humanity could survive even in the darkest circumstances. The women who refused to take off their clothes were asserting their dignity in the only way they knew how. The Americans who chose not to force them were asserting something equally important, that power does not have to mean domination, and that victory does not require cruelty. One of the guards, a young private from Montana named Thomas Whitaker, would later become a teacher like Captain Callahan. He taught history at a high school in Billings for 35 years. He rarely spoke about the war, but when he did, he always came back to those days in Bavaria. He would tell his students that war reveals people at their worst and sometimes, if you are very fortunate, at their best. He would say that the hardest thing he ever did was not fighting the Germans, but learning to see them as human beings after everything he had witnessed. He would say that the women in that camp taught him something more valuable than any military training, that fear and courage often look the same, and that dignity is something you can choose to honor even when you are not required to. His students did not always understand what he meant. War to them was something distant and abstract, a series of dates and battles in a textbook. But some of them remembered his words, and years later, when they faced their own moral choices, they thought back to the story of the women who would not undress and the soldiers who decided that force was not the answer. Margaret survived the war and returned to nursing. She worked in a hospital in Hamburg, helping to rebuild a shattered healthcare system in a shattered country. She never married, never had children of her own, but she cared for thousands of patients over the course of her career. She kept a photograph given to her by one of the American nurses who had examined her in the camp. It showed a group of women in uniform, smiling at the camera, and on the back was written a single sentence in English that she had translated for her. It said, "We are all just trying to find our way home." She kept that photograph on her bedside table until the day she died in 1983. In her will, she left her diaries to a local archive with instructions that they be made available to researchers. She wanted people to know what had happened, not because it was dramatic or heroic, but because it was true. She wanted them to understand that the end of the war was not a clean break, not a simple transition from darkness to light, but a messy, painful process in which people had to navigate fear and hope and try to rebuild some sense of themselves. The story spread slowly, through letters and reunions and the quiet conversations of veterans. Some of the women who had been in the camp eventually emigrated, seeking new lives in countries not burdened by Germany's past. A few ended up in the United States, in Canada, in Australia. They carried with them the memory of those days, and occasionally they would encounter American veterans who had been in Germany at the war's end. The conversations were always awkward, tinged with the weight of history, but sometimes they were also healing. There was a recognition that they had all been caught in something larger than themselves, that they had all made choices, some good and some less so, and that they were all trying to live with the consequences. The war had marked them, but it had not entirely defined them. They were more than their roles as captor and captive, more than the uniforms they had worn or the sides they had been on. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, a group of historians organized a conference in Munich on the experiences of civilians and auxiliary personnel in the final months of the conflict. Margaretta's diaries had recently been published in German, and they had attracted attention for their honest and unflinching account of life in the camps. The organizers invited some of the women who had been at Freising to speak, and they also reached out to American veterans who had served in the area. Captain Callahan, by then retired and in his 70s, agreed to attend. It was the first time he had returned to Germany since 1945. He was nervous, unsure of what to expect, worried that old wounds would be reopened. But when he walked into the conference room and saw Margaret, now an elderly woman with white hair and the same steady gaze he remembered, something inside him settled. They shook hands and then, without planning it, they embraced. It was brief and awkward and deeply moving. They spoke for a long time that day, comparing memories, filling in gaps, trying to make sense of what had happened all those years ago. The conference was not widely covered in the press. It was an academic event, attended mostly by scholars and a few interested members of the public. But the conversations that took place there were extraordinary. Veterans and former prisoners sat together, sharing stories, arguing over details, and gradually building a more complete picture of those chaotic days. They talked about fear and hunger, about the rumors that had spread through the camp, about the moment when Margaret had approached the fence and asked for terms. They talked about the medical examinations, the distribution of food and clothing, the small acts of kindness that had seemed so significant at the time. And they talked about what it all meant, whether it was possible to find forgiveness or redemption in such a context, whether decency in the midst of horror was enough to redeem the larger crimes. There were no easy answers, but the willingness to ask the questions, to sit together and remember honestly, felt like a kind of progress. Captain Callahan gave a short speech on the final day of the conference. He spoke about the difficulty of command, the loneliness of making decisions when there was no clear right answer. He spoke about the women in the camp, their refusal to comply, and his choice to find another way. He said that he had been angry at them at first, frustrated by their defiance, but that he had come to see their refusal as an act of profound courage. They had nothing left, no power, no protection, but they had insisted on being treated as human beings. And that insistence had forced him to make a choice, to either break them or honor their humanity. He chose the latter, and it had changed him. He said that the war had taught him many things, most of them terrible, but that those days in Bavaria had taught him something hopeful. That even in the worst circumstances, people could choose to be better than the moment required. That grace was always possible, even when it seemed foolish or inefficient or against orders. Margareta spoke as well, though she was more reluctant. She talked about the fear that had gripped the women when they were ordered to undress, the certainty that something terrible was about to happen. She talked about the propaganda they had believed, the lies they had been fed about the Allies, and she talked about the slow, difficult realization that they had been wrong, that the Americans were not monsters, that the world was more complicated than the simple narratives they had been given. She said that accepting kindness from the enemy had been harder in some ways than enduring cruelty would have been, because kindness demanded that she rethink everything. It demanded that she see her captors as individuals, not as representatives of an ideology, and that recognition was uncomfortable and unsettling. But it was also necessary. It was the beginning of a long process of understanding and self-examination that had continued for the rest of her life. The conference concluded with a small ceremony. A plaque was unveiled at the site where the camp had been, though nothing remained of the original structures. The field had long since returned to agricultural use, and only a few people in the area even remembered that a camp had once stood there. The plaque was modest, inscribed in both German and English. It read, "In memory of those who passed through this place in the spring of 1945, prisoners and soldiers alike, and in honor of the choices that preserved dignity in a time of chaos." It was not a grand monument, and it would not appear in guidebooks or attract tourists. But for the people who had been there, it mattered. It was a recognition that their experience had significance, that the small acts of decency they had witnessed or participated in were worth remembering. After the ceremony, Callahan and Margaret walked together through the field where the camp had been. It was a warm day and the wheat was growing tall and green. They did not talk much. There was not much left to say, but they stood together for a while. Two old people who had once been on opposite sides of a terrible conflict, and they shared a silence that was more eloquent than words. They were survivors, not of combat or atrocity, but of a different kind of trial. They had both faced moments when they had to decide who they were going to be, and they had both chosen, imperfectly but genuinely, to honor the humanity in the other. That choice had not erased the war or its horrors. It had not solved the vast moral questions that the conflict had raised, but it had mattered to them and to the people around them, and in the end, perhaps that was enough. The story of the women who refused to undress and the soldiers who chose not to force them is not a story of heroism in the conventional sense. There were no battles won, no lives dramatically saved. It is a quieter story about the small spaces where decency can exist even in the midst of great evil. It is a story about fear and trust, about the slow, difficult work of seeing the enemy as a person. It is a story that complicates our narratives about war, that resists the urge to divide the world into simple categories of good and evil. The women were not innocent. Germany's war had been a war of aggression and genocide, and they had been part of that system, however peripherally. The soldiers were not saints. They had killed and destroyed, had participated in a campaign of total war that left millions dead. But in that camp, for a brief time, they managed to treat each other with a measure of respect and compassion that transcended their roles as captor and captive. History is full of grand events, turning points that shape the course of nations and the fate of millions. But history is also made up of countless small moments, individual choices that ripple outward in ways we can never fully predict. The decision Captain Callahan made not to force the women to comply with orders, the courage Margaret showed in approaching the fence and asking for terms, the small acts of kindness from individual soldiers and prisoners. These were not world-changing events, but they changed the people involved. They created memories that lasted a lifetime, lessons that were passed down to children and grandchildren. They offered a glimpse of what is possible when people choose to see each other as human beings rather than as enemies, when they choose grace over cruelty, even when cruelty would be easier and more expected. In the years after the war, Germany struggled to come to terms with its past. The enormity of the Holocaust, the scale of the destruction, the complicity of millions of ordinary people in a monstrous regime, all of this demanded a reckoning that would take generations. The women who had been in the camp near Freising were part of that reckoning. They had to confront their own roles, however small, in the machinery of the Third Reich. They had to ask themselves what they had known, what they had believed, what they had been willing to overlook. The kindness they had received from the Americans did not absolve them of that responsibility, but it did offer them a model of how to engage with the past. If their former enemies could see them as people, if their captors could choose decency over revenge, then perhaps they too could choose honesty over denial, self-examination over self-justification. The American soldiers faced their own reckoning. They returned home to a country that celebrated their victory, but did not always want to hear about the complexities and moral ambiguities they had encountered. The war was supposed to be a clear-cut fight between good and evil, and in many ways it was. But the reality on the ground was messier. The soldiers who had been at the camp knew that the Germans they had guarded were not the same as the SS guards who had run the death camps, but they also knew that the distinction was not always clear or meaningful. They had seen the evidence of genocide. They had walked through Dachau and Buchenwald. They knew what Germany had done. And yet they had also chosen to treat a group of German women with dignity and respect. How did those two things fit together? How did you hold both truths at once? That Germany had committed unforgivable crimes and that individual Germans could still be worthy of compassion? It was a question that many of them never fully resolved. Thomas Whitaker, the young private from Montana, thought about these questions for the rest of his life. In his later years, he participated in oral history projects, recording his memories of the war for future generations. He talked about the combat, the fear, the loss of friends. But he always came back to the camp, to the women who had refused to undress, to Captain Callahan's decision, to the slow building of trust. He said that war was supposed to be about destroying the enemy, but that the most important thing he learned was how to stop seeing people as enemies. He said that it was easy to hate an abstraction, a nation, or an ideology, but much harder to hate a person sitting across from you, hungry and scared and trying to hold on to some scrap of dignity. He said that the war had taught him to kill, but the days after the war had taught him to live, and that the second lesson was harder and more important than the first. The story did not become widely known until the late 1990s, when a German journalist researching the experiences of women in the immediate post-war period came across Margaretta's diaries in the Hamburg archive. The journalist, a woman named Claudia Mehring, was struck by the account of the camp near Freising and decided to investigate further. She tracked down surviving participants, both German and American, and conducted interviews. She found Captain Callahan's military records and contacted his family. Callahan had died in 1992, but his widow and children were able to provide letters and documents that corroborated the events. Mehring also located several of the women who had been in the camp, now in their 70s and 80s, and recorded their memories. The result was a documentary that aired on German public television in 1998 and later on the BBC and PBS. The documentary was well received but did not become a major cultural phenomenon. It was seen as an interesting footnote to the war, a reminder that even in the worst times, individuals could make choices that honored human dignity. But it did spark conversations, particularly in Germany, about the experiences of women during and after the war. For decades, the focus had been on the suffering of men in combat and the crimes of the Nazi regime. The experiences of women, particularly those who had been complicit in or adjacent to the regime, were less discussed. Margaretta's story, and the stories of the other women in the camp, opened up a space for a more nuanced conversation about guilt and responsibility, about victimhood and agency, about how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances. In the United States, the documentary was seen by a smaller audience, mostly on PBS, but those who watched it were moved. Veterans organizations discussed it. High school history teachers showed excerpts in their classes. It became a teaching tool, a way to talk about the moral complexities of war, about the difference between following orders and making ethical choices, about the importance of seeing the humanity in others even when they have been your enemies. The story resonated because it was true, because it was specific, and because it offered a kind of hope that is rare in narratives about war. It suggested that even in the darkest moments, people could choose to be better, and that those choices mattered. The women who survived the camp and lived long enough to see the documentary had mixed feelings about it. Some were grateful that their story was being told, that their refusal to undress and the Americans' response were being recognized as significant. Others were uncomfortable with the attention, worried that it would gloss over the larger crimes of the Nazi regime or make them seem more sympathetic than they deserved. Margaret, had she lived to see it, would likely have felt both things at once. She had spent her life grappling with the contradictions of her experience. The fact that she had been both a victim of circumstance and a participant in a terrible system. The fact that she had been treated with kindness by people she had been taught to hate. The documentary could not resolve those contradictions, but it could acknowledge them, and that was perhaps the most honest thing it could do. Captain Callahan's family was proud of the recognition he received, but they also understood that he would have been ambivalent about it. He had not made his decision in order to be remembered or praised. He had made it because, in that moment, it seemed like the right thing to do. He had acted on instinct and principle, not calculation. The fact that it turned out to be significant, that it resonated with people decades later, would have surprised him. He saw himself as an ordinary man who had been thrust into extraordinary circumstances and had tried his best to navigate them with integrity. That he succeeded, even partially, was a source of quiet satisfaction. But he never saw himself as a hero. He was just a teacher from Ohio who had done what he thought was right, and that was enough. The last reunion of survivors took place in 2005, on the 60th anniversary of the war's end. Only a handful of people were still alive, and most were too frail to travel. But 3 of the women and 2 of the American soldiers made the journey back to Bavaria, to the field where the camp had stood. The plaque was still there, a bit weathered but intact. They stood together, 5 very old people, and remembered. They did not speak much. There was not much left to say. But they held hands, these former enemies, and they wept together for the losses they had endured, and the world that had been destroyed, and the small miracle of having survived it all with their humanity more or less intact. A local photographer captured the moment, and the image appeared in a few newspapers, mostly in the international sections where people who cared about such things might notice. It showed 5 elderly people, standing in a field of wheat, holding hands, their faces lined with age and memory. The caption identified them simply as survivors, and that was true, but it was not the whole truth. They were also witnesses to a moment when decency had prevailed over cruelty, when individuals had chosen to see each other as human beings rather than as enemies. That moment had not changed the world, but it had changed them, and through them, it had touched others, rippling outward in ways that could never be fully measured. The final word on the story may never be written, because history is not finished with us. Each generation reinterprets the past in light of its own concerns and values. The story of the women who refused to undress and the soldiers who chose not to force them will mean different things to different people. To some, it is a story about the limits of authority and the importance of individual conscience. To others, it is a story about the resilience of human dignity in the face of dehumanization. To still others, it is a story about the moral ambiguities of war and the difficulty of assigning blame or credit in complex situations. All of these interpretations are valid, and none of them exhaust the meaning of what happened. The story resists simple conclusions, and that is part of its power. It invites us to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge that the world is more complicated than our narratives allow, and to recognize that even in the midst of great evil, small acts of decency are possible and significant. The camp near Freising was one of thousands of such places that dotted the landscape of defeated Germany in the spring and summer of 1945. Most of them have been forgotten. The people who passed through them are dead, and the records are incomplete or lost. The story of this particular camp survived because a few people chose to remember and to record. Margaret kept her diary. Captain Callahan wrote letters. Thomas Whitaker gave interviews. Claudia Mering did the research and made the documentary. And because of their efforts, we know what happened. We know that on a muddy field in Bavaria, a group of terrified women refused to take off their clothes, and a group of exhausted soldiers chose not to force them. We know that out of that refusal and that choice, something fragile and valuable emerged, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the categories of victor and vanquished, enemy and friend. That recognition did not erase the horrors of the war, but it offered a glimpse of what is possible when people choose to be guided by compassion rather than by fear or hatred. And in the end, that glimpse is worth preserving, worth remembering, worth passing on to future generations who will face their own moral choices and will need to know that decency is always an option, even when it seems impossible. Among the women who passed through the camp was a young girl named Anna. She was 17 when the war ended, barely more than a child. She had been conscripted into factory work in her final year of school, assembling radio components in a facility outside Dresden. When the bombing came, the factory was destroyed, and Anna fled with a group of other workers, walking westward through the chaos of Germany's collapse. She arrived at the camp near Freising exhausted and terrified, wearing clothes that were too big for her thin frame. She had lost her family in the bombing, or at least she thought she had. She would not know for certain for months. In the camp, she attached herself to Margaret, finding in the older woman a kind of surrogate mother. When the order came to undress for medical examination, Anna was among the most frightened. She was young and vulnerable, and the rumors that circulated through the camp filled her with dread. Anna watched as Margaret approached the fence to negotiate with the American commandant. She did not understand much of what was said, but she saw the handshake, saw the respect in the exchange, and something in her shifted. These Americans were not what she had expected. They were tired and worn, but they were not cruel. Over the following days, as the camp slowly transformed from a place of pure fear to something more complex, Anna began to observe the individual soldiers. There was one in particular, a young man not much older than herself, who stood guard near the section where the younger women gathered. His name was Michael, and he was from a place called Wisconsin. Anna did not know where that was. She barely spoke any English, but Michael had a kind face, and he did not stare at the women the way some of the other guards did. He looked away when they were changing clothes or using the latrines, a small gesture of respect that Anna noticed and appreciated. One day, Michael offered her a piece of chocolate through the fence. Anna hesitated, uncertain whether to accept it, worried about what he might want in return, but he simply placed it on the ground near the wire and walked away. Anna waited until he was out of sight, then retrieved the chocolate. It was the first sweet thing she had tasted in months. That small act of kindness, given without expectation, stayed with her. Years later, when she told the story to her own children, she would cry, not from sadness, but from the memory of what it felt like to be seen as a person worthy of kindness, even in the midst of captivity and shame. Michael never knew the impact his gesture had. He was simply sharing his ration, a thoughtless act of generosity that happened to land on fertile ground. But for Anna, it was a lifeline, a reminder that the world still contained goodness, even when everything else suggested otherwise. Anna was eventually released from the larger camp near Augsburg and made her way back to Dresden, or what remained of it. She found her mother alive, living in the ruins of their apartment building, and they rebuilt their lives together in the difficult years that followed. Anna trained as a seamstress and eventually opened a small shop. She married a man who had returned from a Soviet labor camp, and they had 3 children. She lived a quiet, unremarkable life, the kind that does not make it into history books. But she never forgot the camp, or Margaret, or the American soldier who had given her chocolate. When Claudia Mehring tracked her down in the late 1990s, Anna was in her 70s, a grandmother living in a small apartment in the reunified Berlin. She agreed to be interviewed, though she was nervous about speaking publicly. She told Mehring about the fear, the refusal to undress, the slow transformation of the camp. And she told her about Michael and the chocolate. Mehring included Anna's story in the documentary, and it became one of the most memorable segments. Viewers responded to the simplicity and honesty of Anna's account, the way she described both the terror and the small moments of grace. After the documentary aired, Mehring received a letter from a man in Wisconsin. His name was Michael Patterson, and he had been stationed near Freising in May 1945. He had seen the documentary and recognized himself in Anna's description. He remembered the camp, though his memories were fragmentary and colored by time. He remembered the women, their fear, the orders that had seemed cruel and unnecessary. And he vaguely remembered sharing chocolate with a young girl through the fence. He had not thought about it in decades, had not imagined that such a small gesture could have mattered. Mehring facilitated a correspondence between Michael and Anna. They exchanged letters for several years, cautious and formal at first, then gradually more personal. They never met in person. Michael's health was failing, and the distance was too great. But they wrote to each other about their lives, their families, the war and its aftermath. And in those letters, they found a kind of closure, a way to make sense of the strange and difficult days they had shared. The correspondence was later donated to a museum in Wisconsin that focused on the experiences of local veterans. It became part of an exhibit on the human dimensions of war, displayed alongside photographs and artifacts. School groups visited the exhibit, and some of the teachers used the letters as a teaching tool, asking students to reflect on the power of small acts of kindness and the long shadows cast by war. The letters raised questions that had no easy answers. What did it mean that an act as simple as sharing chocolate could have such lasting significance? What did it say about the nature of memory, that both Michael and Anna had carried this moment with them for decades, even when, They had forgotten so much else. And what did it say about the war itself, that amidst all the death and destruction, such moments of human connection were still possible? The story of the camp near Freising and the individual stories within it became a kind of parable about the choices we make in extreme circumstances. It illustrated the tension between following orders and following conscience, between seeing people as categories and seeing them as individuals. It showed that even in war, even when the moral landscape seems clear and the enemy is obvious, there are still moments when we must decide who we are going to be. Captain Callahan faced such a moment and chose compassion over efficiency. Margaret faced such a moment and chose courage over compliance. Michael faced such a moment and chose generosity over indifference. And each of these choices, small and seemingly insignificant in the vast machinery of war, created ripples that spread outward, touching lives and shaping futures in ways that could never be fully anticipated or measured. But the story also raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of responsibility and guilt. The women in the camp were not war criminals. They had not run concentration camps or participated in massacres, but they had been part of the Nazi system, however peripherally. They had worked in factories that produced weapons. They had served in organizations that supported the war effort. They had, in most cases, believed the propaganda, supported the regime, or at least accepted it without resistance. Did the kindness they received from the Americans absolve them of that complicity? Did it mean they were innocent, or merely that their individual guilt was less than that of others? These were questions that the women themselves struggled with. Margaret wrote extensively in her diaries about the burden of guilt, the difficulty of reconciling her gratitude toward the Americans with her shame about what Germany had done. She did not find easy answers. She simply tried to live honestly, to acknowledge both the kindness she had received and the crimes her nation had committed. The American soldiers faced their own moral complexities. They had fought a just war against a monstrous regime, but they had also done terrible things in the course of that fight. They had killed, sometimes in ways that haunted them. They had seen friends die and had hardened themselves to death. They had witnessed the concentration camps and had felt a rage toward Germany that was deep and justified. And then they had been asked to guard and process German prisoners, to make decisions about how to treat people who, until recently, had been the enemy. The choice to treat the women in the camp with decency was not a simple or obvious one. It required them to see past their anger, to recognize that not all Germans were equally guilty, and to act on a principle that seemed almost naive in the context of total war. That they made this choice, or at least that some of them did, speaks to something essential about the human capacity for moral reasoning, even in the most challenging circumstances. The story also illuminated the gendered dimensions of war and its aftermath. The women in the camp faced particular vulnerabilities because of their gender. The fear of sexual violence was not abstract or paranoid. It was based on real experiences and widespread reports of what happened to women in war zones. The decision to refuse to undress was, in part, a refusal to accept a vulnerability that they saw as unbearable. The American response, the decision to honor that refusal and find another way, was a recognition of that gendered vulnerability and a choice not to exploit it. This aspect of the story resonated particularly with female historians and scholars who saw in it a rare example of men in positions of power choosing not to use that power to dominate or intimidate women. It was not a heroic act exactly, but it was a decent one, and in the context of war, decency was rare enough to be remarkable. The broader historical context also matters. The spring of 1945 was a moment of extraordinary chaos and flux in Europe. The old order had collapsed, and the new one had not yet taken shape. Millions of people were on the move, fleeing, searching for family, trying to survive. The Allied forces were overwhelmed by the scale of the displacement and the logistical challenges of occupation. In this context, individual decisions by commanders like Callahan could have significant local impact, even if they did not change the broader patterns. The camp near Freising was one small eddy in a vast current, but for the people caught in it, it was their entire world. The choices made there shaped their experience of the war's end, and in many cases, the rest of their lives. As the years passed and the survivors aged, the story of the camp took on new meanings. In the immediate post-war period, It was simply a memory, often painful and confusing, something that the participants did not talk about much, even among themselves. In the 1960s and 1970s, as the study of World War II became more academic and the generation that fought the war began to age, there was a growing interest in personal narratives and oral histories. Some of the participants began to talk more openly to contribute to the historical record. By the 1980s and 1990s, with the publication of Margaret's diaries and the work of journalists like Claudia Mehring, the story began to reach a wider audience. And in the 2000s, as the last survivors passed away, it became a historical artifact, preserved in documents and recordings and memories, subject to interpretation and debate. In Germany, the story was part of a broader reckoning with the Nazi past that has continued for generations. The question of how ordinary Germans participated in or resisted the regime, how much they knew about the Holocaust, and how they should be judged by history, these questions have been central to German identity in the post-war period. The women of the camp near Freising occupied an ambiguous space in this reckoning. They were not perpetrators in any direct sense, but they were also not victims in the way that the Jews and other targets of Nazi genocide were victims. They were somewhere in between, people who had been caught up in a terrible system and who bore some measure of responsibility, even if that responsibility was limited. The kindness they received from the Americans complicated their story, making it harder to fit into simple narratives of guilt and innocence. In the United States, the story was part of a different conversation, one about the nature of American power and the moral character of the American military. The narrative of World War II in American culture has often been triumphalist, a story of good defeating evil, of American soldiers as liberators and heroes. That narrative is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The reality was more complex. American soldiers were capable of great cruelty as well as great kindness. They committed atrocities and war crimes, though on a far smaller scale than the Axis powers. And they also made choices, like the one Captain Callahan made, that honored human dignity even in the midst of war. The story of the camp near Freising offered a counter-narrative, or perhaps a complementary narrative, to the triumphalist account. It showed American soldiers at their best, not in combat, but in the more difficult and ambiguous work of occupation and reconstruction. The documentary made by Claudia Mehring became a valuable educational resource. Teachers used it to prompt discussions about ethics, about the nature of war, about the importance of individual choice. Students watched Anna describe her fear and Michael describe his memories, and they were moved by the humanity of both. The documentary did not offer easy lessons or clear moral conclusions. It simply presented the story as honestly as possible and invited viewers to grapple with its complexities. Some viewers focused on the heroism of Captain Callahan and the soldiers who chose decency. Others focused on the courage of the women who refused to be dehumanized. Still others focused on the larger context, the crimes of the Nazi regime, and the difficulty of finding redemption or forgiveness in such a setting. All of these perspectives were valid, and the documentary allowed space for each of them. In the final analysis, the story of the women who refused to undress and the soldiers who chose not to force them is a story about the fragility and resilience of human dignity. It shows that dignity is not something that can be taken from us, though it can be threatened and violated. It is something we must assert and defend, even when we have no power, no protection, no reason to hope. The women in the camp asserted their dignity by refusing to comply with an order that they experienced as dehumanizing. The soldiers honored that dignity by choosing not to use force, and in that exchange something valuable was preserved, something that might otherwise have been lost in the chaos and brutality of war's end. The story also illustrates the power of narrative and memory. What happened in the camp near Freising in May 1945 was significant to the people involved, but it might easily have been forgotten. It was Margaret's choice to keep a diary, Callahan's choice to write letters, Whitaker's choice to give interviews, and Mehring's choice to investigate and document that ensured the story survived. Each of these choices was an assertion that the story mattered, that it had something to teach, that it deserved to be remembered. And because of those choices, we have access to a richer and more complex understanding of the war and its aftermath. We see not just the grand sweep of history, the battles and the treaties and the political decisions, but also the small human moments where individuals confronted moral choices and made decisions that revealed who they were and what they valued. The legacy of the camp near Freising is not a simple or straightforward one. It does not offer a clear moral lesson or a tidy resolution, but it does offer something valuable, a glimpse into the complexity of human behavior under extreme stress, and a reminder that even in the worst circumstances, we retain the capacity to choose decency over cruelty, compassion over indifference, humanity over dehumanization. That capacity is fragile. It can be overwhelmed by fear, by ideology, by the pressures of the moment. But it exists, and it can be cultivated and honored. The story of the women and the soldiers at the camp reminds us of this, and in doing so, it offers a kind of hope that is grounded not in naive optimism, but in the hard-won knowledge of what human beings are capable of, both at their worst and at their best. As we look back on that spring in Bavaria, 70 years removed and living in a very different world, it is tempting to see the story as quaint or distant, a relic of a time we can barely imagine. But the moral questions it raises are timeless. How do we treat those who have been our enemies? How do we balance justice with mercy? How do we see the humanity in others when we have every reason to see only their guilt or their threat? These questions are as relevant today as they were in 1945. We face them in our politics, in our communities, in our personal relationships. And the story of the camp near Freising, in its specificity and its honesty, offers us a model of how to engage with these questions. It does not give us answers, but it shows us people wrestling with the questions in good faith, making imperfect choices, trying to do the right thing even when the right thing is not clear. That wrestling, that effort, that commitment to honoring human dignity, even in the most difficult circumstances, is what the story ultimately celebrates and preserves. If this story resonated with you, please like the video. It helps us keep forgotten history alive. Subscribe for a new story every week. The past is full of moments like this, small and easily overlooked, but no less important for being small. They remind us that history is not just made by presidents and generals, but by ordinary people making choices in difficult circumstances. They remind us that we are all capable of both cruelty and compassion, and that which one we choose makes all the difference. The women who stood in that camp and refused to undress were asserting their dignity. The soldiers who chose not to force them were asserting theirs. And in that mutual assertion, they created something rare and precious, a moment of grace in the midst of chaos, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity can endure. That is the lesson of their story, and it is a lesson worth learning, worth remembering, and worth carrying forward into whatever challenges we face in our own time.